Hello, everyone. I'm John Kane. I'm a professor in the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University, but currently stuck in the United States in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was teaching at Yale when the COVID-19 virus caught me, and here I still am. So it seemed kind of appropriate when Professor Chujong Pham of the Electoral Regulation Research Network asked me to address the issue of the likely effects that COVID-19 crisis will have on the forthcoming elections in November. Very important elections, so I'm sure you'll agree. Before I begin, let me start with a kind of cautionary quote, cautionary for myself and all prognosticators, really. It comes from Hans Morgenthau, who was a famous international relations scholar and realist scholar, in a book he wrote in 1948 called Politics Among Nations. And he begins with this warning: the first lesson the student of politics must learn and never forget is that the complexities of affairs make implied solutions and trustworthy prophecies impossible. In every political situation, contradictory tendencies are at play, and which tendency will actually prevail is anybody's guess. The best the scholar can do is to trace the different tendencies which, as potentialities, are inherent in a certain situation. And that's the kind of attitude I'm going to take today towards this address, looking at where American politics are at the moment, where they're possibly going to go, what the tendencies are, if you like, and the different pressures are within the environment, this strange, very strange environment we're currently in. Here we are, we presume at least, these are the two main protagonists in November for the presidential election at least. Joe Biden and himself, President Trump. Biden, I say, is the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. Presumptive because he still hasn't got the requisite number of delegates to be actually confirmed in that, and we'll talk a bit further about Biden later on. What's at stake in this election? I said it's an important one. According to Noam Chomsky, in a recent interview he did on television, Noam Chomsky is 91 now, I think, so he's the voice of wisdom and age coming across time. He thinks we're approaching the most dangerous point in human history. The virus will pass, he says, yes, but the crucial challenge that remains for him, the world, is climate change, a challenge that we have not even begun to address. And we can't address it, he thinks, unless, and this is quoting Chomsky, we remove the malignancy in the White House. The sense is that the world has come to some kind of tipping point or inflection point, as is sometimes said. History trundles along one way for a long time, everything seems fixed in granite, and all of a sudden, kabang, and the world changes. We had such events in 1989 when the collapse of the Soviet Union. Twin Towers came down in 2001. The course of American political and world political history changed thereafter, and so on. One might see another inflection point when Donald Trump comes unexpectedly to power in 2016. What are the consequences for the US political system? Well, it's well known by now that Trump has presented a challenge to the whole constitutional system. He's pressed on points which other presidents have not pressed on and revealed cracks and fissures within the whole structure of American politics. Recently, Trump has had several run-ins with the various governors of states in America. Where does constitutional authority finally lie? Trump is making grand claims, some grand claims. There's only one real authority, and it's the president, and the president can do pretty much what he likes. Most scholars would not think he has much constitutional authority for saying that kind of thing, but nevertheless he asserts it. That's the nature of Donald Trump, he asserts whatever. But who has responsibility in looking after the COVID crisis? Is it the governments or is it Trump? On some days, if he wants to shift blame, well, the governors ought to be doing it all. Other days, if he wants to assert his own authority, he says, no, they've all got to do what I tell them. So it becomes problematic, to say the least, about where authority really lies here. And he has, without penalty, eroded or ignored constraints once thought firm, revealing them to be mere conventions. As we know in Australia, coming from a Westminster system, that a great deal we have a written constitution too, but a lot of our constitutional imperatives and practices come from our inheritance from the British Crown, and they're what we call conventions. And so our Australian system runs partly on convention, partly on the written document, quite complex fashion. Well, American Constitution is kind of a holy writ, as you know, in a way that our Constitution in Australia is not, and very important written document, much argued over and interpreted over the years. But Trump's pressed on points which things that one thought, should one, if Congress subpoenas you, do you turn up? Of course you do. Everyone always has in the past, but Donald says, no, I'm not turning up, and neither are the people who work for me. And what happens? What's the consequence? There's no consequences. What seemed like a firm rule, which is actually not written anywhere, turns out to be convention, much like many of our conventions in our Westminster system. And this puts a strain on the whole system. Hyperpartisanship in America, hyperpartisanship around the world, of course, has increased, but in America it's hugely exaggerated. One might ask, and I do ask, and I remember when Obama, shortly before he finished his term, he gave an interview on television. He said, the American system is broken. And I'd been living in America for a year or so during the Obama administration, and I'd come to the same conclusion. You can't govern in America. The Congress is blocked between Republicans and Democrats who will never, the congressional system will not work unless you reach across the aisle and agree to do certain things. But here we are. We have a system where Republicans just say no. This was Mitch McConnell's argument when Obama came to power. We'll make him a one-term president. We'll say no to everything he asks, however reasonable, even Republican doctrine, we will override for the sake of just sheer opposition. Where have all the moderate Republicans gone? Vanishing breed. The much more extreme fringe of the party has kind of taken over the party. And of course, here's where Donald Trump comes in. He's not really a Republican at all. He was not accepted as a Republican when he ran. In fact, they opposed him. But once he won, then he was a Republican. Don't care who you are, you've won and you're a Republican. And in part, Donald remakes the Republican Party in his own image, but also his useful tool of Republicans who want to get conservative judges in courts, especially the Supreme Court, but all other courts too, and lower taxes on rich people and so forth. So Donald Trump is, in one sense, an anomaly, but in another sense, is kind of a logical conclusion of the history of the Republican Party, which after this, and this election coming up, is kind of a test for the Republican Party too, not just for Donald Trump, because it's a party in peril, some would say, and I would say, of having stepped so far out of touch with the mainstream American opinion that it's in danger, once the Trump phenomenon is no longer with us, of imploding really. And this happens from periodically in history of party structures change. Is this another inflection point, an inflection point in American politics? What damage will 4 more years of putting internal stress on the system do to American politics? We'll only find out if Donald Trump wins the election and the Republicans hold the Senate in November. Many people do not want to find that out. They fear the worst. They've had 4 years already, or nearly 4 years, and it hasn't looked pretty. And of course, you have to think on the international stage too, where has American leadership gone? Even traditional allies have come to distrust America. Fintan O'Toole had a piece in the Irish Times the other day. He said, people have looked on America in many ways, over many years, over a couple of 100 years, with envy, with hatred, with longing sometimes, with affection, etc., etc. Because this is the first time the world has ever looked upon the United States with pity. And why is it a pity? Because they seem incapable of governing themselves, incapable of having a reasonable health system which serves the public, and COVID-19 has starkly brought the dysfunctionality of the American system into sharp relief. So it's an important election. Whatever we may think of Trump and the Republicans, or the Democrats and Joe Biden, we know that this is an important election. Chomsky, by the way, has always been a severe critic of American, especially American foreign policy. He's not a particular fan of Joe Biden's, but hey, any port in the stop. So COVID-19 likely effects in November. Well, taking my own advice via Hans Morgenthau there, thinking about the dangers of prediction, practically every prediction, not just in America, but in politics, in our country, in Australia, in Europe, in Great Britain, have been wrong over the last decade or so. It's very, very hard to predict, and things come out of left field that no one predicted. So much for political science. But we can look, as Morgenthau says, at kind of the tendencies, and we can just think about, what, and this is how I'm going to address this for the rest of this talk, what advantages has Trump got? What's going for him? But what are the disadvantages? What is he having to face? Both Trump and Biden will have a look. I'll mainly look at Trump, and Biden will be there in the wings, waiting to attack. So, looking at the positives, if we can call them that, for Trump, I think I've got 4 here, starting at number 1. Number 1 is the Electoral College advantage. Is it an advantage for Donald Trump? The Electoral College is a peculiar institution in American politics. This is how Americans elect their presidents. It is a very strange system. It's not a direct election by the people. It's an indirect election. As you may know, the people elect electors in each state. Each state gets so many electors based on the number of senators and the number of congressional seats the state holds. And then these electors, we have the famous primaries, both in Republican and Democratic primaries, where you have to win to even, as Joe Biden is trying to do, to win your nomination for your party. And then when the election comes up in November, people go to the polls and you win so many electors. Most states, all states but 2, if you win the state, a majority in the state, you get all their electors. So a big state like California, which has got many, many congressional seats, that's a lot of electors, or Texas, or New York. Small states like North and South Dakota, Idaho, only a few things. Well, what's the advantage then? Well, there's a certain balance in the Electoral College this was devised, by the way, by the founding fathers in America in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. There was an argument about how the president should be elected. We're going to have a president. How do we appoint the president? Well, you could appoint them from this Congression, the House of Congress could appoint a president or the Senate. Many people didn't want that. They wanted it would look like too much the president was in the pocket of the congressional people, and that would upset the balance of powers which America is based on, separating executive, legislature, judiciary, quite extremely. Didn't really want a popular vote or a democratic vote on a majority for a whole number of reasons, but one of them was based on the small states, Maine at the time, said, well, if we get trampled on if New York or Massachusetts gets many, many more delegates than we've got, therefore we will make sure that we have 2 senators from each state. Doesn't matter how big your state is, how small your state is, you get 2 senators. And given that you get all small states get 2 senators, most of the small, less populous states are in the Midwest of America, but they all get 2 senators. That means they get 2 electoral college votes. And this kind of overbalances and that's what it's intended to do, is to give the small state advantage in the presidential election. But it means, since most of the Midwestern states are what they call red states, that's Republican, safe Republican states, it gives a slight balance, on balance, an advantage to Republican candidates. This is sometimes overridden by electoral politics, but this is true. It also means that if you're a voter in New York, or these are the blue states, that means they vote Democratic very reliably, or in Massachusetts, you don't really count in a presidential election because everyone knows you're going to vote Democratic. Or if you're in Texas, you're going to vote Republican. And Texas actually is, as they say, going purple. It's more and more immigration into Texas is changing its political character, and so it may become a state of a slightly different color over the next few years. But meanwhile, what states really count are what called the swing states, or sometimes the battleground states. You have to get delegates in. Well, look what Trump won in 2016. He won states which Obama had held in 2 elections, and Obama had held them with quite substantial majorities. These are Iowa and Ohio, which are a couple of small states as far as population goes. And the big 4, and these are the big 4: Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And famously, Hillary Clinton presumed, because these were reliably Democratic states and Obama had won them twice, it wasn't worth spending time and money campaigning. And she never went to Wisconsin, for instance, at all. Which Wisconsin people disliked very much. And she paid the price for it, of course. Trump held them, these swing states. And can he hold them again is the big question in November. And because it was quite a slender number of voters which won him the Electoral College votes in these 4 fairly large states. Well, we don't know. We'll see him. But if the Electoral College, which remember, Trump did not win the popular vote. 3.5 million votes more went to Hillary Clinton. And it's the peculiarity of this Electoral College system that this can happen. This happened back in 2000. It's happened in the 19th century a few times. And it happened in 2016, where you can win the presidency, but not win the popular vote. Now, I said before, beware prediction. One is always wrong. As soon as you put your head up on the block, it'll get chopped off. But I think I will make a prediction that whatever happens in the election in November, the presidential election in November, Trump will not win the popular vote again. Now, if Trump wins the presidency again and does not win the popular vote again, I think there will be a large impulse in American politics. There already is among some people who think the Electoral College is unfair, the system is unfair, should be reformed. There'll be a huge outcry, I think, that there's something fundamentally undemocratic about this, and the Electoral College has to be changed. And it's very hard to do because electors are written into the Constitution, and the Constitution is very hard to change. You need majorities, 2/3 majority in Congress, both houses, and you need 3/4 of the states to say, okay, that's hard to do. It's been done, there's been amendments, but it's very hard politically to do. So, but if Trump wins again, but loses the popular vote, I think you'll see lots of outcry about that, anti-democratic. Second thing going for Trump, I'm going to say, is support, Republican support. I said before that when Trump ran for the Republican nomination, he was not perceived as a Republican at all, never mind a traditional Republican. In fact, once upon a time, he'd been on the Democratic side of politics. Nevertheless, and many people in his own party, in the Republican Party, didn't like Donald Trump at all, tried to stop him. And they've still got some Republicans who call themselves never Trumpers. They still exist. But when the election came, guess what? Republicans turned out, it didn't matter who was sitting in that seat and being the nominee, they would vote for him. They voted for him as they normally do. Normal Republican loyalty, you always vote for Republican. Never vote for a Democrat. I certainly wouldn't vote for that Democrat, that woman, as Donald Trump might call her. What no one quite foresaw was normal Republican loyalty is one thing, but election shift. Republicans sometimes don't turn out in large enough numbers, Democrats do. And that's going to be an issue in the forthcoming election, a big issue. But this base that Donald cultivated with his curious quasi-fascist rallies, the cult-like following that he has created amongst a certain group or groups of now what they call in America conservative, which always makes me smile. Very little conservative about them is in a traditional way. And he cultivates this base relentlessly. How big is this base? It depends. Somewhere between 30 and 40%. I always say 37% because it's a good number. Don't ask me why. 37%, they seem to stick with him whatever what, doesn't matter what he says. And there was a great deal of, why did Trump win? Now in the election 2016, there was a great deal of resentment amongst certain groups of people, amongst many people. Congress has very, very low approval ratings, the swamp it's called. And Donald kind of rode on these resentments against what people saw as the establishment. Someone said of Trump, you don't understand, they don't follow him because they like what he says or they care whether he lies all the time or not. Donald Trump's a weapon they're using against the political establishment. They've sent him in there to wreck it. And there's some vengeful nature of a thing going on here. So the 37% is very important. It's allowed Trump to survive, and more than survive, to dominate the Republican Party. Why? Because these are passionate, some would say insanely passionate followers, and some of them control who gets and can. If you're a Republican, a traditional conservative Republican, they don't want you. You won't get nominated for primaries. In primaries, you'll get voted down, and a much more extreme radical person will be put in your place. So it brings fear. The base brings fear to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, by and large, has been cowed and kowtowed to Donald Trump. Whatever he does, he gets away with. Impeach him, who cares? The Senate will let him go. And so it is. This is a problem for Biden, I think, in the enthusiasm gap, as it's sometimes called, when you have fanatical Trump, make America great again supporters, and then you have Joe Biden, sleepy Joe Biden, as Trump dismissively calls him. This, to some extent, was a big factor in the 2016 election. Hillary offered herself as content, a policy wonk. You can trust me, 3 o'clock in the morning, everything's done. People weren't looking in 2016 for reliability. A great many people were looking for a shake-up of the system, and Donald promised them precisely that. And that enthusiasm gap played, I think, against Hillary. There were many factors involved, but that was certainly one of them. And it's going to be there again, I think, with Joe Biden, although I'll qualify that a little later. We don't know. Is the virus still going to be around in come November? Is it still going to be a problem? Are we going to have a second wave? Who knows? We don't know. And this is the problem, of course, with the current crisis. Who knows where we'll be, where the virus will be next week, next month, 3 months. Very pleased to see the University of Queensland seems to have struck upon a promising avenue for a vaccine, but even that won't come out till mid next year. What effects will the COVID-19 have in November? Depends. It's a few months down the track yet. And as Harold Wilson once said, a week's a long time in politics, 3 months is almost an eternity. And polls keep popping up and down. Donald had a bit of a bump in the poll when he started looking like he was handling the crisis and managing it, but then that slid away somewhat. But it pops up and down, and things change. Things change rapidly in these crisis situations. Hard to say how Trump's handling the crisis will be judged. Will he have changed his tune? Will he look more presidential? And so forth. We'll see. It may be that COVID is not a disadvantage to him, but can play to his advantage. It really should be playing to his advantage. Crises usually do play to the incumbent's advantage, but we'll address that in a minute. Pro-Trump number 4. Where's Joe? Where is he? Well, Joe's in his basement in Wilmington, Delaware, where he lives. And, well, he's stuck, isn't he? He's stuck in the basement. Whereas, where's Trump? Trump's on television every day. That's picture down there is Donald Trump in his daily briefings, which not quite having any more since last week. But these daily briefings were going on for a couple of hours, and there's Donald front and center. He wasn't originally, it was Mike Pence, the vice president, who was front and center, because Donald had appointed him as the overseer of the COVID crisis. But then when Trump saw what attention Pence was getting and the potential ratings, which Donald loves, TV ratings, he stepped into the role and dominates and has dominated the television networks for a couple of months now. And Joe, after he won the Wisconsin primary and Bernie Sanders stepped aside, he's hardly been seen. When he has been seen, it's just broadcasting from his basement. Remember, Joe Biden's former vice president under Obama, but he's not a congressman, he's not a governor of the state. Governors have got a lot of attention during this COVID crisis because they're the ones on the front line who've been having to handle it. Whereas Biden, he's just in his basement, so he's not being visibly seen. This gives Trump seems to give Trump anyway, a huge publicity. And that's what it's all about. It's who's out there, who's being seen, et cetera, et cetera. At least it's a big part of it. Except I'll qualify that in a little while too. What's against Trump, given this COVID crisis? Well, Trump is he's a conspiracy theorist. He came to prominence politically, not in television terms, but politically when he was one of the Obama birthers. Where's your birth certificate, Obama? Are you really an American? He's kind of conspiracies he fosters, nurtures. He's kind of part of that milieu. And it's an anti-intellectual milieu. He's basically a climate change denier. I'm not sure he's an anti-vaxxer, but you know the crowd I'm talking about. There's a strong, in this populist movement around the world, but certainly in America too, with Donald Trump as the cheerleader, there's a strong anti-intellectual strain. You can see the problem that Trump has in his daily meetings with Anthony Fauci, the epidemiologist, who's supposed to be providing expert input into the presidential response to the crisis. But there's huge tension between them because Trump comes up with all sorts of things which are just, many people think, crazy, and Fauci has to then come in and step in and say, oh, wait a minute, it's not quite so. And this has led to a serious perception of leadership failure. Again, see Trump versus the governors. The governors of many states, not all states, the kind of Trumpian governors of some of the smaller southern states have been very, very slow to react to the virus. And some of them are paying for it now because they took Trump's lead, and Trump's lead was, first of all, don't worry about it. It's not going to be serious. It's not going to affect the United States. So it looks like a serious leadership failure on Trump's part. It can't be a good thing. This is someone who came to power saying the political leadership in America was terrible, and he, as a successful businessman, was going to show everyone how it was done. If you fail in the thing you promised you were going to be great at, this is surely a negative. And COVID has certainly, while it's given Trump a platform, it's also seems to some Republicans who are very nervous about Trump's performance in these daily briefings, that you saw the last one just before he canceled, thinks they're not doing any good. And Republicans thought, no, they're not doing us any good either. You're making yourself look a fool, ingesting disinfectant, for instance, to combat the virus. This was a huge backlash here in America, and Trump stopped this briefing. So all of a sudden, they're not doing any good. It's too much exposure. You can have too much exposure of the wrong kind, and your polls start slipping. You're seen not to be doing the job you're there for. Presidential leadership is first, all leadership, political leadership is first of all accepting responsibility. Trump famously did not. He says, no, I'm not responsible for all this. Now, of course, he's not responsible for the virus, but if you're president of the United States, you are responsible for taking a leadership role in combating it. And Trump hasn't looked good at that. The big one, of course, we're in the crisis, the health crisis at the moment, still to come out of that. But we all know there's going to be a huge economic hit to this too. We don't know how severe. Some people predict another 1930s-like depression, which will be horrible if it happens. And it's already hurting people all over the world, particularly in poorer parts of the world. So it's, but for Donald Trump, personally, this was what he based his hope for re-election on in November. Look at my stock market. Look, it's going through the roof. Look, Americans are back at work. Look at the economy. We're doing fantastic. And it's my claim to fame. It's all to do with him, of course. He's been such a good leader. Well, I blame Trump for that. That's what all political leaders do when things are going well. He either did it. When they go bad, it's someone else's fault. But at least to this keenness, Trump's keenness for Americans to get back to work, too quickly back to work, as many people think. Well, why does he want to do that? Well, there's a problem here for all of us. For American, you in Australia too, as much as anywhere else. How do we balance the damage to the economy with the health risks and necessities? It's a tough one. Most medical people here say that steadily, slowly, we don't want the second wave of the virus to hit as it did in 1918-19, which killed millions of people. Let's do it carefully and let's not overwhelm our health systems. But he's eager to get back, Americans to get back to work because, hey, if the economy is bad in November, that never goes well for an incumbent, never goes well. Doesn't matter, the buck will stop here. Number 3 against Trump. This was a result, I say a straw in the wind, maybe a haystack in the wind. I don't know if you followed this in the Australian situation. This was a same election or the same time in Wisconsin where Joe Biden won the primaries. No one paid too much attention to that, but he did win. And then Bernie pulled out. But the main focus of people's attention was the voting for a Supreme Court position. And the Supreme Court has been dominated by conservatives. This is the Wisconsin Supreme Court, not the United States one. The state Supreme Court, dominated by conservatives, but Jill Karofsky, who's a progressive, challenged against an incumbent who was a very deep-dyed conservative, not just a conservative, but one with very vocal Trump backing. And it was somewhat of a fiasco because the Democratic governor of the Wisconsin, given the COVID virus crisis, didn't want people to be flocking out to vote. And people didn't want to be manning voting booths in these dangerous times. He wanted to postpone the election. It was challenged by Republicans. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It says, no, we're going to have the election on this day. And by the way, do we have to count all those postal votes, which haven't got the right date on them? And Republicans, both the Republican legislature and the Supreme Court, which is dominated by conservatives now, thanks to Donald Trump, basically tried to block her efforts to become, but she won. And this is a huge surprise. Not only did she win, she won by a lot, by 10 percentage points. So, of course, this is a huge problem in American politics. Part of the reason people say that the American political system is broken is that there's gerrymandered districts, mostly Republican, but not solely Republican, highly gerrymandered districts. There's a great deal of suppression of the vote, which is what was going on here in Wisconsin. But in the end, Republicans didn't care whether people went out and caught the COVID virus. and they expected that to work on behalf of the Conservative candidate, and it didn't. So is this a straw in the wind? I'm sure it gives Donald Trump and the Republicans great pause that this was the result. Am I going to therefore say there's going to be a blue wave in November? No, for the reasons I said before. And I come back again to this question. This is against Trump this time, not for him. Where is Joe Biden? Well, we know where he is. But is this actually a blessing in disguise? There's actually an article in yesterday's New York Times saying that Joe's not hiding, he's lurking. Why is he lurking? I think the headline of the piece was, when someone's busy self-destructing, don't get in their way. And this is an argument for what Donald's been doing in all his public appearances and his somewhat crazy interventions in the health crisis. So Joe is better off out the way. And Joe, after all, is not a great orator. He's not a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton. He's gaffe-prone Joe, as they call him. He's liable to put his foot in his mouth when he opens it. He performed quite well in the latter parts of the primaries. I thought his speech he gave when he won the Super Tuesday primary was a very good one, very moderate, very moderated and well presented with no gaffes. But Joe can always come up with the gaffes. So the longer he's off the set and the more people see of Trump on the set doing what seems to be an abysmal job, this could be Joe's advantage. But again, here we are, and it's just the end of April coming up, the beginning of May, and we have to wait till November the 4th. What are my conclusions? My conclusions are, and this is my head speaking, pardon these cartoons. This is Tom Tolles from the Washington Post. It's one of my favorite cartoonists. In ordinary times, one would think a president who's performed as poorly as Trump has just got to be finished. But these are not ordinary times. They've not been ordinary times since Trump came into office. And there's a surprising number of people, not just his diehard 37% supporters out in the Midwest, who, for whatever reason, love Trump. And they're going to vote for Trump in November, come what may. Will that happen? I think it's possible one's head, that's my head, and I certainly will not predict, because Trump has, how many trials has he gone through? I don't mean actual trials, but challenges to his leadership, and the attempt to impeach him, etc., being the final one just before the COVID virus struck. But somehow or other, he's like the rubber man, bounces back up again. Is this what's going to happen in November? Democrats fear this hugely. On the other hand, the enthusiasm that Trump's supporters generate, and he generates when he rallies them, is perhaps going to be offset because there's a deep and abiding feeling amongst many, many, not just liberal people, but sort of what one might call semi-reasonable people, that enough's enough. And so I think there's going to be, turnout's going to be hugely important. And Biden might not, in his person, arouse much enthusiasm, but he will have the advantage of huge anti-Trump sentiment in the, now will it be enough? And will it be enough, crucially, in the battleground states? I note that Wisconsin, that Biden is leading Trump in the polls at this stage. Can we count on that? We don't know. Will he be back once more? We'll see. We'll have to wait till November. And it's not just the Trump, there's lots of elections going on in November. Governorships get handed over. Congress, the Senate. Senate's very important. And shall we see? Is this a tipping point? If it is, which way will it tip? We look forward to that. Thank you very much. I shall say farewell, if I can figure out how to turn this thing off.